When I began my research on the Nietzsche-Gedächtnishalle, I was not in Weimar but in Berlin at the time. In the beginning, I read a lot about the building. I looked at some photographs and spotted a lot of different information. Therefore, before I arrived in Weimar to visit the object in March last year, I already felt like I knew the building a bit. When we had that very brief and speedy tour given by the caretaker of the building, I realized that I've had no idea how huge it really was. So the tour left me confused but very impressed by the dimensions of the building. But it also felt as if everything I had read about it was useless up to that point. My theoretical knowledge could not be applied to the object itself. It could not be approved in situ. Everything seemed to fall into disparate parts. When I continued the research, it felt a bit like starting again. What really helped was being on site and being completely free to approach the object. Retrospectively, I would say that all the information remains quite isolated up to that certain point when all the research material unfolds and melts into what I call an integrated perspective on the building. This process happened in a very special way when the Sender Weimar enthusiast Mr. Handwerk gave myself and the other researcher, Maurizio, an insightful guided tour on the building's usage as a radio station in the GDR period. He showed us around the building and filled all the rooms with images and meanings. With these meanings, our fantasies immediately started to construct a narrative. Who worked here? Whose closet was that? How did the secretary get along with the director? Where was the director's office? And what happened in the basement with its vaulted ceilings? I think that's the most important thing. During research on an architectural object, you naturally begin to invent a narrative. When you've gained that certain view and when you've read most of the literature, you are able to tell what each part of the building was used for or when it was built. In our case, in this phase, the object became our baby, which was definitely emphasized by the fact that we were the only ones who had the key for the building. In the next steps of research, something different happens. You follow a layer of history or you have a certain idea and you follow this line on inquiry. At one point, I actually dreamt of the time period I was researching on when I focused on the literature and on archives of the period. I had strong dreams about Nietzsche, his sister Elisabeth, the Nietzsche Archive employees, Henry van de Velde, and also Harry Graf Kessler. I was really captured by this early 20th century period, the suggested atmosphere, the dresses, the way of talking. Also important to mention is that what was maybe interesting before could turn into being completely obsolete for the future research. For example, there was the fact that Harry Graf Kessler planned to build a huge temple with a stadium on the site where the Nietzsche Memorial Hall is now situated. We researched a lot into these plans in the beginning, but the further we went through the chronology, the less important this really interesting aspect became for the preservation documentation, which was actually the core of our work. New information didn't seem to have such a great impact on the collected knowledge, resisting the possibility that the integrated perspective could be turned upside down by it. We found some of the archive materials which revealed the GDR period to us. Plans emerged alongside detailed descriptions, which allowed us to reconstruct the building process and the usage of some parts, but also gave us an insight into daily life at a GDR radio station. Our research revealed that the stone floor in the foyer hall was not as originally planned, but misplaced after World War II. It was moved from the hallway in the lower story to the hall upstairs. It was fascinating to learn the real story behind the substance of the materials, and it affirmed our investigations in the way that our deep research had an effect on digging for truth. The same thing occurred with the marble. We found out that the marble plates had been laid because a Hitler bust was supposed to be set up. However, due to the value of the bust and the portrayal, a simple stone floor was no longer venerable enough. In the meantime, we thought that the stone porches in the basement floor would disclose the way of a crypt. But after tracing this assumption in literature and after adjusting the floor plan of the basement with this possibility, the crypt ought to be found in the apsis, we soon realized that the idea had to be discarded. So, the time period you actually research on is always the most important time period. Often you couldn't tell how important it really was within the overall context. When I speak about the story of the building to someone, I always try to address it to his or her specific background. If you write it down, you tend more to summarize and abbreviate it. We started the on-site research outside in the summer because we knew that being outside would eventually become difficult for surveying and taking photos in the coming winter months. But we needed to find a starting point, and it was exactly in this period of research that we found ourselves quite confused. So we decided to start our investigation with the finest materials inside and outside of the building and the parts that were most manageable, the entrance door and the entrance hall. Our first aim was to map out the building, so we took photogrammetric images. For that, we had to borrow a big ladder and to print out some stickers with pass points, which we mounted onto the walls. So our research began, after reading some literature in Berlin, with very pragmatic and manual methods. This haptic approach, I think, played an important role. Because the more time you spend in the building, the more commitment you feel for it. Furthermore, if you can approve the facts you read or find in the archives on site, you confirm your integral view on the building. You create proven knowledge, which in turn makes you feel more self-assured regarding your work. Actually, at a certain point I felt that we were real experts. And I still think that Maurizio and I are, at the moment, the persons who know the building best, even if we don't know every single detail. We tried to stick very strictly to the conventional research practices, which made it easier for us to systematically collect data without interpretation. As we learned during the process, sometimes you just lack the knowledge at the time you find something, and sometimes you don't even know that you have found something. It reveals its importance in a later moment or different context. But still, there were some findings we didn't know how to handle. For instance, name signs on the door frames, which belonged to former employees still working for the MDR in Erfurt today. Would it make sense to mention them in the documentary for a coming generation, or is it an irrelevant detail no one is interested in? Since we focused on the history of the building, the aim was to tell a story, or maybe a lot of different stories that all somehow surrounded the object. Of course, it's always hard to establish the parameters concerning the question, what is important for architectural research in this storytelling context? How do you mention your thoughts that come up while spotting the photos of Nazi officials during the Richtfest and the whole iconography for the National Socialist era? How do you disregard your feelings about the Heil Hitler on every single letter you read in the archives? Naturally, the rooms for which you lack written sources are the most difficult to research into. Therefore, the rooms that were rebuilt, refurbished, and used during the GDR period left many open-ended questions. For example, we still don't know when exactly the soundproofing panels were built, and there seem to be panels of different periods inside the building. It would be very helpful to be supported by expertise or knowledge of a keen amateur who researches on soundproofing or something similar in his or her leisure time. There is a room on the ground floor which was pretty much destroyed. The panels were pulled out, the big studio window was demolished, and the glazing had been stolen. And there are wooden panels and insulating materials hanging from the ceiling. You gain a deep insight into the cheap construction of, at that time, a high-tech studio. If you turn the light on, the situation appears bizarre, almost like a piece of art, like an installation which has been prepared specifically for this site. We don't know how this former studio looked like, but every time I see it, it reminds me of a perfect stage for Thomas Demand artwork. He builds models of architecture or space precisely after images which he finds in newspapers. And the image office, in German Büro, for instance, shows a room which was left in a mad rush, all the sheets and documents spread over the furniture. Demand's image of the scenery shows exactly the same motif, but the sheets are empty. It's the image of a moment that bears the past and the now, but the photograph rejects to be a witness. You try to imagine a narrative, try to imagine what could have happened before, but the motif stays fictional. I feel the same about our room. We will maybe never find out what happened, but everybody has a story in his or her mind what could have happened. Of course, even more difficult was the basement. Fungus was spread all over the carpet, even on the doors. And not only was it slippery down there, but we also got a headache and we had no light. So we could only go there for a little while, long enough to take some photos. The most significant problem researching the Memorial Hall was the size of the building. We had to ask ourselves how to avoid approaching it only on a surface level. The whole building has a gross floor area of 5,000 square meters. So we had to permanently reassure ourselves to not get lost in too many details, for we had only 4 months to complete our research. Conversely, we wanted to obtain a comprising view on the whole building. So we had to find a balance between detail and overview without neglecting facts or with too much interpretation with a focus only on certain time layers or building parts. Another problem occurred during the documentation of the building in words and photos. Firstly, you always have a very narrow knowledge base as a single person. So we often had to obtain the other's opinion in order to avoid false results. Secondly, you need to agree on a system of description and you have to know the technical terms, but describe it as easily as possible, so later users of the documentation will be able to understand what is written. Sometimes you just couldn't answer a question because there was no possibility of looking inside the construction or the materials. Some of the more restrictive problems were of course the mold formation in the basement floor and the resulting headaches. Also the problem of not knowing how to switch on the light in the basement or the barricaded windows and doors. I've never had a negative perspective on the building's history. It never appeared as an evil place. However, in the beginning, we knew it was built during the Nazi time, whatever that means. But this was especially because of the building's certain appearance, its roof, decoration, details, shape, size, and its specific materials like stone and marble. Maybe one could say the building was imbued with an enigmatic aura. The less you know about an object, the more dramatic a fantasy that comes into your mind and fills the rooms. It's a moment of naivety, a good childish naivety that increases your excitement, that triggers your fantasy. And this naivety becomes less and less the more you research in a scientific way. One could say that there's a steady changing of protagonists. Sometimes you focus on the one, sometimes on the other, aiming to get to know them better. When I read a lot about the architect, Paul Schulze-Naumburg, and his life story, for example, I kind of sympathized with him. You kind of begin to link yourself personally with a research object slash subject. When I think of other research projects, this process seems to be a natural one. As you begin to attach yourself to the building, you also bind yourself to the creator of the object. There were different stages of transition. Transition is kind of the key for understanding the building's history. It is the overarching topic of the whole story. The first transition took place directly after World War II. The former Nietzsche-Gedächtnishalle was transformed into a radio station. The very same workers that had originally started working on the construction site were now hired to complete it. They really tried to complete it to a satisfactory standard. They attempted to procure good material. For instance, they wanted parquet flooring, but after the war there was no parquet available, so they took the stone floor from the basement and put it in the hall. They shortened the portals in the pre-hall and made some new ones out of the leftovers. On first sight, you don't even recognize that they are from a different period. Maybe one could say that the hall was symbolic for the transition from a dictatorship into a regime. They wanted to look different, but only a little bit. Even if they had had the means to do refurbish the hall, would they really have attempted to mark a new age? The GDR radio administration really tried to handle the restoration as befitting a prestige object. But as time went by and the money ran out, they became a little careless. Less conventional constructions were applied. Soundproofing doors were built in a do-it-yourself manner, and the acoustic panels were probably made in the workshop outside of the building. The whole provisionary look seems to be a continuing transition, a transition that eventually became static. Since the last employees moved out, the building is still in a transitional state. What is going to be the next usage? What will happen to it? Architectural conservation reveals a certain issue. As you work on an object's history, the more important details become problematic. Everything gains an historical dimension, and everything turns into a puzzle piece set within a larger story. In fact, to abandon any detail turns it into a falsifying and discriminating act. This perspective on history is more problematic when dealing with the conservation of monuments. This became clear when we came to realize our aim of identifying mandatory parts, layers, etc. that had to be preserved or removed. We became aware that it is all about estimating, about the estimation of history, historicity of substance, and about subsequent interpretation. Personally, I felt unable to cope with making these decisions. I felt insecure with estimating parts of the building. I would have liked to shift the responsibility to someone else on the one hand, but I also wanted to preserve the building by myself on the other. Because I think of myself as an expert regarding the object, I totally distanced myself from those demands that related to aesthetic reasons. I felt this aspect to be too disputatious. The result would always be irreparable. I think a removal of substance would interfere too much with the interpretation of the historical layers. Sometimes I even think that it would be best for the building to be left in its temporary state, or to act in a romantically radical way and allow for its decay. Every new utilization would deprive the building of its ruinous character, which touches the people on a very emotional level. If one idea is being realized, all the future potential, all fantasizing about a new utilization will be buried. I would love to see the building being handed over to the public again. I see our research as a basis for all forthcoming activities concerning the building. The next step would be to work on a concept that fits with Weimar. The design, art, and architecture classes of the Bauhaus University, for example, could be involved by holding workshops on memory and material, on visualizing memory materials within historical architecture, and on reusing building. I also think that it should be integrated into guided tours, that it should be a spot where the Nazi ideology and the intersection with arts, philosophy, and architecture could be discussed and worked on. It really links the different disciplines. The outcome of the collaborations could be really prolific. For us, the cooperation between art historian and architect was really generating additional knowledge that none of us would have had by working in isolation with the means of a singular discipline. The feeling of responsibility has a kind of half-life. Whilst researching, you feel a strong responsibility for the building, but when it comes to an end, you feel like your obligation dilutes more and more. You also realize that a lot of people are very interested in the results and the stories in the building, but this enthusiasm is, of course, also limited. The more time passes, the less you feel bound to the building. It feels a bit like out of sight, out of mind, unfortunately. But this also reveals how strongly I was connected to the substance and the physical proximity to the memorial hall as mentioned in the beginning. My first idea was to have a museum for the reappraisal of architecture during National Socialism in it. I think that Weimar would be the perfect setup for this issue, for it comes up with several really interesting landmark buildings, like the Gauforum, the Villa of Gauleiter Fritz Sauckel, the enlargement of the Goethe Nationalmuseum, or the concentration camp Buchenwald and general Nazi administration buildings spread all over the city. And I think it would fit perfectly to the city's very ambivalent relationship to the Nazi past. Sometimes even it seems that this infamous part of the city's history is being superimposed by an emphasis on the specific time period of classicism, the time of Goethe and Schiller. Also, Nietzsche himself had been taboo since the end of World War II until the beginning of the new millennium, so I would dream of changing exhibitions about a certain topic that copes with the problems regarding this kind of architecture. The exhibitions could range between showing certain architects or buildings that deal with overarching topics of Nazi architecture and pseudo-religious rituals. Exhibitions could also contain discussions about future proposals for these buildings, especially concerning heritage conservation. Another interesting thought that came to our minds was to have a museum about propaganda in the building, for it was the scene for Nazi propaganda of Nietzsche as philosopher of the Third Reich, as well as a media instrument of propaganda for the Soviet military administration, and then finally for the GDR. I would of course be happy to have a permanent exhibition of our results regarding the former Nietzsche Memorial Hall in it. Likewise, I'd be happy to have a lot of artistic and architectural activities in the building. As I'm interested in interdisciplinary work, I see workshops about the memorization of history within substance as a probable subject. Also, I would love to see the building as a kind of laboratory for architectural and artistic interventions. Of course, all these ideas should somehow cope with a given space without destroying anything. The building with its acoustic furniture would be perfect for rehearsal rooms for the students of the Franz Liszt Music University. The big hall could function as a rehearsal space for the orchestra of the National Theatre Weimar. The former office rooms could be converted into studios or offices for emerging designers and architects. The space in front of the terrace could function as a guerrilla garden. The yard is a good place for getting together, a cafe or whatever, because the noise is well insulated. Speaking only for me, I would love to see some students of architecture transform the building inside with the help of our results. I would love to see which ideas they have, how they cope with space and memory and with the different layers and the problematic history of the building. How will they express their thoughts in architectural forms? I would love to see an appropriation of the building, an approach to it, a play, etc. I also like the idea of an audio guide. Maybe there could be a tour with audio material whilst standing outside the building or inside the building. It could be mixed with audio documents, interviews, and a speaker's voice. Maybe there could also be a movie. A drama about the building of Nietzsche-Gedächtnishalle and the protagonists.